Here you go. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the lands of the people of the Kulin Nation. And I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and this land always was, is, and will be Aboriginal land. And I would like to pay my respects to elders from the lands of which you're all joining us from. So I will run you through a little bit of what we're going to cover today, a little bit of an agenda, and then we'll just get straight into it. And apologies if my voice is a bit muffled and if I catch wrong words. I'm slightly sick, so bear with me today. What we're going to do today is we're going to hear from Nikita, our campaigner, on a little bit of an overview and address of what is unfolding in Gaza, and give us a little bit on what Amnesty International has been doing there, and just what sort of like our researchers on the ground have been doing. We will then pass to Ammar, and I'll introduce Ammar later when we get to it, from APAN, who will share his perspective on this as a Palestinian. We will then pause for a little bit of questions, so you have time to ask questions at that point. So if you have questions throughout, please feel free to send them. And then we will go to a little bit of a session that I will take you through that will cover what is in our toolkit that we released sort of like last week, and we'll focus on some of the actions that you can take to mobilize for Gaza. And then we will have another little bit of space for questions. So lots of time to answer any questions that you might have. And as I said, if you can do so through the Q&A function, that would be easier for us. And without taking up too much more of your time, I will just pin our speakers and I will pass to Nikita.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for coming along tonight. It's really great to see so many people here. As Margarita mentioned, I'm a campaigner at Amnesty International Australia, and that includes campaigning on our research concerning what is happening at the moment, but also what has happened for decades in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. Many of you may know this, but I think it's a good introduction to what Amnesty does in times of conflict. Amnesty plays a really active role, both as an organization that does research into human rights abuses in conflicts, but also as an organization that campaigns for human rights to be respected. So right now we have field workers in Gaza who are documenting human rights abuses and who are working around the clock to do so. And they are working with our researchers around the world who are also documenting human rights abuses. And we do that in a number of ways. We are very fortunate to have a dedicated worker on the ground who can interview people on the ground, who can take photos of airstrike sites, but we also interview people on the phone. We verify video and photo evidence. We use satellite imagery. And we do all this work. We work with the United Nations, with journalists who are able to report on what's happening, to raise awareness of what is happening on the ground, and also to analyze what's happening against the laws of war or international humanitarian law. And we do that so that people are aware of abuses of international humanitarian law, but also so that we can campaign to end those abuses. And as people know, I think very well now, abuses of international humanitarian law have been committed at a horrific rate in recent weeks. And we are incredibly concerned by what we are seeing in Gaza. And what we are calling for at the moment is a ceasefire. We are mobilizing here in Australia, but all around the world in support of a ceasefire. So we are raising awareness in the media. We're talking to MPs. I'm in Canberra at the moment to meet with MPs about a ceasefire, and also taking action and standing in solidarity with communities impacted by what is happening in Gaza, and also in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories more broadly. And I'm really grateful to Ammar for being here today to share the experiences of the community here in Australia, but also around the world as they face these horrors. And researching is really important work we do at Amnesty, but we as an organisation know that research itself is not enough, and what needs to accompany that is this campaigning, and that is by staff like me, but also by people such as yourselves. It's so crucial in this moment to be mobilising, to be pressuring your MPs, whether that's your local member, but also the Minister for Foreign Affairs, to be taking actions to show solidarity, like attending protests. We know that these small steps can make a really big difference, and they are incredibly important in this moment. To touch on Amnesty's research and what we have found, we have found that there have been crimes, as I mentioned, committed that continue unabated. That begins with the 7th of October. We've verified video evidence of Hamas killing civilians and taking hostages. And we've been clear that Hamas needs to end their practices of killing civilians, and using indiscriminate rockets. But also we've called on them to release the hostages. The response by Israel has been horrific, to say the least. And I think we are all aware of that death toll, and that is far too many people to have been killed in a small matter of weeks or any time. We are documenting airstrikes that are incredibly concerning on residential buildings, on marketplaces, on refugee camps, and as we've heard a lot over the weekend, on hospitals. And the airstrikes that we've documented, we consider to be war crimes because they have been indiscriminately targeting civilians. And some have also constituted direct attacks on civilian objects. In that research, we've documented whole families being killed by these airstrikes. And when you accompany them by the cutting off of food, water, fuel, and electricity, which has now been cut off for a number of weeks, there is an incredibly concerning humanitarian situation in hospitals. Hospitals, as we know, are shutting down because they are running out of fuel. And we have been really clear from the moment that it was announced that this siege, the blockade of Gaza, would be increased. And Gaza has been blockaded for 16 years, which is in itself collective punishment. But it has been really clear from the moment this was announced, this increased blockade, that is a war crime, that is collective punishment. You should never punish civilians for the actions of an armed group. And that is what is happening. And it is causing a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And we've been really concerned and called for the Australian government to recognise that this is an unequivocal war crime. We've also documented the use of white phosphorus in both Gaza and Lebanon by the Israeli Defense Forces, which is incredibly concerning. It causes horrific injuries. And we are really worried about the cutting off of communications, again, accompanied by the cutting off of fuel and electricity, what that means for people in Gaza trying to communicate, and the impacts on their human rights. And for all these reasons, and that we have done more research, that is a small summary of what we've done, and also acknowledging that Israel is committing the crime against humanity of apartheid, and that has been going on for decades in the occupied Palestinian territories in Israel. We are calling for a ceasefire. We are incredibly concerned, as I mentioned, about the death toll. We believe a ceasefire will obviously put an end to that death toll, but also to the war crimes that are being committed unabated, and will also help organise a release of the hostages. So we are mobilising at the moment in support of that ceasefire around the world. As I mentioned, I'm here in Canberra to meet with MPs, and I know my colleagues, I've spoken with them in South Korea, in the US, and in many, many countries who are doing the same. But we're also encouraging people like you to take action, because we know that action is incredibly important when it comes to pressuring politicians. And we are seeing some changes from politicians both in Australia, but also in the international community, that is coming from the pressure from people taking to the streets, from people emailing and calling their MPs. And it's really important that we keep this pressure up in the coming days and weeks to get Australia to call for a ceasefire. We're also calling for an end to arms exports to Israel. We've called for that for a number of years, because we are concerned that any arms sent to Israel will be used to commit war crimes, and also as part of Israel's apartheid system. And we're also calling for support for the International Criminal Court, because it is so important, given the scale of these atrocities, that they are able to investigate and hold people accountable. And the Australian government hasn't declared whether they are supportive of the International Criminal Court's investigation. I think that's quite disappointing. So we'll be continuing to call for that in Australia, around the world, but we also ask that you join us and join the Palestinian community and the Jewish community who are calling for a ceasefire, who are really witnessing horrors every day, and are doing so much that they can to put an end to these horrors, and need support from people like you. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm really proud to be here with Ammar, to be hearing from him. He is a Palestinian Australian. He's the founding president of the Palestinian Cultural Society at the University of WA, and he was an intern at the Australian Palestine Advocacy Network, who do incredible work to protect the human rights of Palestinians. And he'll be able to share the Palestinian community's response to this violence here in Australia, and how people can support that response and take part, and what the reality is today for his family in both Palestine and Australia. So thank you so much, Ammar. I will hand over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, so as Nikita said, I just want to walk through, I guess, from a more personal perspective, like what our experience has been going through all of this, what the experiences of my friends' extended family in Palestine has been, and some of the things that we're doing as a community, some of the things APAN are doing, and how that can all be supported. I think first and foremost, our response has been a lot of shock and a lot of trauma. A lot of members of the community right now are really deeply traumatized by what we're watching unfold in front of us. A lot of like, for most people I know, this has been a really distressing month. Most of our routines now kind of revolve around work or school during the day, and then at night we're just stuck glued to our TVs or our phones in horror and just witnessing what's happening. For those in the community that are from Gaza or have family in Gaza, it's been especially difficult. It's been a constant state of anxiety and fear. Most of them are struggling at the moment just to keep basic contact with their families. So sometimes, I know a friend of mine who said sometimes the best he can get is that he just sees the message has been read. He's sent messages to his sister or his father, and just seeing the message has been read tells him that they're still alive. I have two close friends from Gaza, and they're both very well-known, beloved members of the community here. So I'll share some personal stories from them. One of them, for the last week or so, has been completely unable to contact his family. The only way that he's able to try and tell whether they're alive or not is to just constantly monitor the list of the deaths and just see if any of their names appear, which is a really surreal experience. It's a very emotionally exhausting experience for him and for his wife. He's actually afraid, even though he's spoken a lot about Palestine in the past, he's afraid at the moment to speak out and engage with the media. And it's not out of fear for himself here, but it's out of fear that his young sons will actually suffer retribution when he next tries to visit Palestine. Israel are quite infamous for abusing Palestinians at the borders. They often reject entry to people who have been known to engage in any sort of advocacy. I actually personally went to Palestine in July with quite a young member of the community. He was just 23 years old, and he had never been there before. He got rejected for exactly that reason. So we're not only dealing with the grief of watching things happening, but there's also that sort of suffocation of knowing that speaking out and speaking up, engaging with media and putting our names out there can actually cost us significantly. It can cost us entry into our homeland. And when you get rejected at the border like that, then you can't ever get in. You have to apply in advance. So it completely cuts us off from our family, from our friends, completely cuts us off from our ancestry. So there's a lot of fear around that kind of adds to all of the stress. Another friend of mine who's also got family in Gaza, and he was raised in Gaza, he studied there, his university has been destroyed now. He spoke at a rally a few weeks ago, and he spoke a lot about his young sister who was trapped there and the constant state of fear he was in for her safety. And then barely a few hours after he got up and spoke at that rally, he got the message that his sister, all three of her kids, the oldest one, who was 5 years old, had been killed in an airstrike, and 17 members of her husband's family had been killed in that same airstrike. Just a few days ago, he posted an update from his brother, who miraculously escaped death. An airstrike targeted a house just 10 meters away from them. The windows and doors within their house were shattered and collapsed on top of them. In Gaza now as well, there's a really horrific state of affairs going on for pregnant women, where there are, I think, tens of thousands of pregnant women who they've got no resources, they've got no aid, they can barely get access to food or water. Babies are being born and have been, I mean, I'm sure everyone's seen it, but there are lots of babies who've been in incubators in these hospitals that are running out of fuel. And a number of them are starting to die now because the fuel runs out, the incubator can't function anymore. There's no aid or resources to provide to the babies. So it's a constant state of complete ongoing trauma for anyone from Gaza, for anyone, even for us who are Palestinian but aren't from Gaza, just watching what's going on. And then those of us with family and friends in the West Bank are also dealing with the really harrowing events that are happening there. So the entire West Bank now, they seem to have exploited the attention that's being focused on Gaza, and the entire West Bank's been completely fragmented. Towns and cities have been basically besieged by closures of all of the checkpoints. So they've been cut off from one another. If you live in Nablus, you can't go visit Jenin, you can't see your family or friends there. A lot of people can't work anymore. Life is pretty much just ground to a halt. So the Palestinians in the West Bank now are simultaneously horrified witnessing the mass slaughter that's happening in Gaza, but they themselves are also living in complete fear. Every night since October 7th, there have been dozens of raids that happen across all over the West Bank, like multiple towns, multiple cities and villages all at once. There have been over, I think, 2,000 arrests now, almost 200 Palestinians killed in the West Bank just since October 7th. I'm actually from Jenin, and I've got extended family there, and that's been hit with particular brutality. There was one raid last week, it was on Saturday or Friday night, that killed 14 people. They repeatedly raid Jenin with military bulldozers, just rampage through the streets and tear up all of the roads. They destroy buildings, they destroy the infrastructure. So my family there are basically just in shock at what's unfolding. I've got a close friend who lives in Hawara, which is a town, some people might be familiar with the name because it hit the news back in February when it got hit with a huge pogrom-like settler attack. And she's completely stuck within her town. All the checkpoints leading in and out of the town have been shut. The main road passing through the town is only for Israeli Jews. Any Palestinians who step out onto it or even just try and walk along it now are shot at with live fire. It's been repeatedly attacked hit with these mass settler attacks, probably three times now since just in the last month or month and a half. Before October 7th, actually, on October 5th, there was a massive settler attack in the town. And a close member of her family was shot dead. A 19-year-old student who was just on the roof of his house was shot dead by a settler. Absolutely no accountability, no investigation. The shops are forbidden to open. It's very difficult or almost impossible for anyone to leave the town or travel to any nearby cities. So people are struggling just to get basic necessities like medicine or food. I've got a friend in Nablus, and she's pretty much in complete shock. She can't even find words to describe what's happening in the West Bank. So there's an overwhelming sense of fear and anxiety there about things that are happening. We're seeing a sort of new status quo where now Israel are hitting areas in the West Bank with airstrikes. They've done it in Jenin a few times. They did it in the Tulkarem refugee camp just in the last day. There's completely rampant settler violence. There are mass daily raids and killings. The whole region has been fragmented, and there's a lot of fear that this could represent a new sort of permanent reality. And then within the Israeli borders itself, so I've got a cousin who lives in Haifa, and she's pretty much just stayed indoors with her whole family since this all started. Her husband, used to work 5 days a week. He barely works 1 day a week now. They've been suffering severe repression since October 7th. Getting arrested even for liking social media posts. They're suffering complete alienation and antagonization from the local Israeli Jewish communities there. So it feels like what we're witnessing, it's not just, they call it a war on Hamas, but it's not. It's a very comprehensive campaign of collective punishment on the entire Palestinian population in Gaza, in the West Bank, and within Israeli borders. The Palestinians that have the Israeli citizenship, on all of them. It's a war on the whole population. And here in Australia, like, our response as Palestinian Australians has been, a mixture of shock, concern, concern for our loved ones, a lot of helplessness that we can't actively do a lot to help them, and a lot of anxiety about the future. But there's also a level of kind of disgust at the response that we've witnessed from our government and the media here. It's not just the complicity of it all, but there's also this sense that we feel that as Palestinians, we're denied even just victimhood. Like, you get this rhetoric in the media where Palestinians are reduced to either being Hamas or to being human shields. A Palestinian who's killed in Gaza is either a Hamas militant, or if they're a civilian, they're a human shield. So there's no innocent Palestinian victim. And it's tough to reckon. It's tough for us as well to kind of reckon with this idea that there's so much of a system set up that means we probably implicitly contribute to this in some way through the products we buy, or the products our companies that we work at buy, the taxes we pay that go towards military exports to Israel, the companies our superannuation funds invest into, all sorts of things like that, where we feel we're invisible, we're kind of blinded to the fact that we actually almost support this with our own money. And so that all brings me to what the response has been. And I'll talk through, I suppose, a few categories of different things that are going on, and how anyone can step into any of those spheres to help out. So the first is to make solidarity as visible as possible. So that's engage with the local, in whatever state you're in, there's almost certainly a community organization. Here in WA, there's Friends of Palestine. In Melbourne, there are multiple. I know there are multiple all over the country. So find your local community organization, engage with them, attend the rallies and protests that they organize if you want to get involved with them and help organize those sorts of actions. Speak to the people around you, to colleagues, friends, family, about what's happening. Even though it feels like a small action, if everyone does that, all of those things add up to something much bigger. Then we've got the sphere of political lobbying, and that's something that APAN does quite a lot of at a federal level. So there's a lobbying trip they're doing right now with federal politicians. But the more voices there are that speak up, the harder it is for politicians to just ignore this. If you email or call your politicians, again, even if it feels small, just doing it as an individual, when they get tens and tens and tens of thousands of emails or calls, they can't ignore the problem. APAN have actually put together really useful templates on their website to make that as easy as possible, especially sending an email. You can do it within a few clicks. They've got quite a nice template for how you can go about making a phone call to your local politicians. The third sphere, and I'll put up links to all of the APAN resources in the chat as we go on. The third sphere, I think, is media engagement. So there are two things we can do here. Again, I know APAN have a list of like media responders that they keep, and that gives them people they can ask whenever they get contacted and asked for like an opinion. But if you contact media outlets and you express your disappointment in how they're covering this problem, again, when they get a lot of that sort of feedback, they can't ignore it easily. And that's also something that I know APAN have put together resources around how we can do that. And if you know, even things like the talkback radio shows, the more people there are that when those things happen that call in and talk about what's happening, that the sort of depth of the situation, the more we really rebalance the coverage of this whole problem. And then the fourth and last one that I'll touch on is obviously boycotting. So BDS is probably the biggest global boycott movement. They've put together a kind of useful list of the most important companies to target, so that this, you know, if people want to take action, they can take action in a targeted and effective way rather than just random scattered sort of boycotting. So I'd encourage everyone to check that out. I'd also encourage, and again, APAN have made a tool to simplify this, encourage people to check what companies their superannuation fund invests in. So that's the general, I mean, the four spheres, I guess, to recap: advocacy, lobbying with politicians, the media, and boycotts. And just to end for now, I guess that I'll recapture what Nikita said, which is the immediate focus right now is a ceasefire. People in Gaza just can't even breathe right now. But even once we accomplish a ceasefire, that's not really the end of it. We can't go back to this sort of situation we had before October 7th, where Palestinians just silently suffered under this sort of system. So that's where I'll end. I just saw a question about if there are resources. There are resources. I'll find all the links and I'll put them up in the chat as we go along. But yeah, that's all from me on this one. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Ammar. Thanks for sharing your contribution. Really value that and appreciate. Takes a lot of effort and courage and emotional time as well, and for sharing all of those ways to act on this. Before we move to question, maybe I'll just get Nikita to reiterate just kind of like what Amnesty's position is and just our calls, and that will give you all some time to put in some questions if you want in the Q&A function. We have some that have come through the Google form, but if you have others, feel free to add them in now, so we'll get to them.
Thanks so much, and thank you, Ammar, for coming along tonight and sharing. It is horrific, and I think the point you ended on is so important, that what happens now is important, but also what happens next. And we've witnessed this apartheid system for decades, and you know, so many of the things that you mentioned are so key to that system, things like checkpoints, raids, the blockade of Gaza, and we really need to see the international community taking steps to dismantle that system of apartheid, because people in Gaza, but also in the West Bank and within the borders of Israel, cannot continue to live like this. So I want to reiterate, as I said, we're calling for a ceasefire at Amnesty. for a number of reasons, but particularly to put a halt to deaths, to put a halt to attacks that are violations of international humanitarian law and war crimes. We want governments around the world to be supporting that call for a ceasefire, and we also want them to call for respect of international humanitarian law and to condemn war crimes, regardless of who is the perpetrator. We also need in Australia to see action being taken with regards to our arms exports. We know that there are many permits that have been approved to be sent to Israel in recent years. And if people don't know the system, we actually do not know what is approved to be sent because it is not transparent at all in Australia. We just know that a number of permits have been approved. And the Australian government also doesn't track what happens once arms are approved and shipped from Australia. And so we find that incredibly concerning. We need to see an end to arms being sent to Israel, but also a reform of our arms export process because it is failing and it's failed for a number of years. And we also want to see, as I mentioned, the Australian government, but also the international community supporting the International Criminal Court so that they can investigate these abuses and hold people accountable for violations of those abuses. But the really key call now is for a ceasefire. And that's the one we want everyone to get behind and be taking action on. And I think I'm handing over to Margarita, who'll share how you can take that action.
Yeah, I might just, sorry, I'm just trying to do a few things. I just removed the spotlight, so that's a bit weird. I might just do some questions before we go to that because we have a few. And also, if you want to ask a question out loud, like feel free to put your hand up as well. And we'll get to you. So I'll just ask one of the questions that we got from the form, which is around, and I'll probably go to you, Nikita. How much does international humanitarian law still matter in this conflict when one side is protected by Western powers, protected in, those things, while the other is seen as getting what it deserves?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think in my mind, it makes it more important than ever because there is a clear standard to which we expect parties to any conflict to follow. And there's a clear standard by which we can assess violations. And so when we talk about international humanitarian law, the key principle of that is the protection of civilians and the steps that parties should take to protect civilians. And when we are able to say concretely that steps are not being taken to protect civilians, I think it's really important to have international humanitarian law there as a body. But none of these bodies of laws or of organizations, I think, exist in isolation. And that's why it's also so important to be taking action and be calling on governments to abide by international humanitarian law and to not be, I think we've seen a lot of hypocrisy, as the question mentioned, particularly in the West, with countries' approaches to international humanitarian law. And that's why we have to be mobilizing in support of it, in support of the civilians who are not being protected, and to call on our government, but also institutions, whether it's the media or the International Criminal Court, to be acting in accordance with these principles and making sure that civilians are always protected. It's unfortunate that it's not always applied equally, but that's the role of organizations like Amnesty, but also of people, everyday people, to make sure that international law is respected regardless of the power of any particular government or party.
Cool, thank you, Nikita. I might just, there was the question, so this came in the Q&A, and maybe we might answer a little bit of this as well in the next part where we'll talk through actions, but I don't know whether Ammar or Nikita, you have some thoughts. Sorry, I'll just move this to enter live so you can see, or everyone can see it, from Rakib, which is in terms of raising awareness, different people seem to go about this in different ways. Some people post a lot, some prefer to just talk about it in their circles, and another few ways. So Rakib is asking, what's the most appropriate and effective way, in your opinion, to go about this? And regarding emailing MPs, would it be worth doing that every day for greater effectiveness, or could I please have some thoughts on this? And then the last one is around boycott lists and whether how do we know if we can trust certain boycott lists? So I don't know whether either of you wants to give some thoughts on that.
Sure, I could jump in a little bit on that. Yeah, so you're right. There's a lot of people do a lot of different things. I'd say doing something is definitely better than doing nothing. So if you do feel paralyzed looking at the amount of action that's going on, just pick the space that you feel you're most comfortable operating in and where you have the most to contribute and jump in. Doing that is better than I suppose the paralysis of doing nothing. And all of them serve different purposes anyway. So it's not necessarily a problem as long as there's some coordination, and there are bodies that do try and provide that coordination. On the topic of boycotts, I did post a link in the chat to BDS's website where they've sort of addressed that problem of scattered boycotting, where a lot of people target randomly different companies. So that site particularly that page tries to focus on the really key players that we can target. So I think but BDS have been around the longest in this space and are probably the most trustworthy. So I don't see a reason to, I suppose, distrust them.
Cool. Thanks, Ammar. Nikita, did you want to add anything?
Not particularly. I think it's important that there are a lot of options for people. I think it can be overwhelming, but I think it's also important to remember that a lot of them don't actually take too much time. So, calling your MP may seem overwhelming, but it only takes a few minutes. And in my experience, calling them is normally pretty simple. They will take what you are saying on note. They'll then report that back to the minister, to the member of parliament, so they know how many people have called and what they've said about particular topics. And I think it's really important in this moment to have moments that work for everyone, actions that work for everyone. So if you are someone who wants to have conversations with family and friends, that's really important. But also, if you are able to attend protests, it's so important to be on the streets and so important to be advocating to your member of parliament. So please do, I think, work out what you can do. As Ammar said, it's better to do something than nothing, and do that. And it's always in these instances, I think, a good idea to rope in family and friends if you can. It's sometimes much easier to do these things with a few other people than by yourself, and that can help with if you are a bit nervous or unsure and want some support. And make sure you are checking out what APAN and your local organizations are doing and how you can support that.
Cool. Well, I might go to another question that we got in the form, and then I'll just talk you through some of the actions with the toolkit, which some of them very much mirror what Ammar said. So the last question before we move, and there's more time for questions, so please feel free to share them. We received a few questions around sort of like freedom of speech rights and just discrimination in Australia on this issue specifically. So I guess to try and summarize some of those that we've received is, how can we speak up about Palestinian human rights and show our support for the people in Gaza without feeling discriminated against? And maybe like, what are freedom of speech rights, or like, right to protest and those things. So I can go to Nikita and then Ammar, if you want to add something as well, feel free.
I think, unfortunately, we have very limited freedom of speech or protections for freedom of speech in Australia, aside from some implied constitutional freedoms. But we don't see, too many attacks on freedom of expression in Australia. If you do think you are being silenced, we have seen some really worrying responses to protests in Australia, but also around the world. So we're actively monitoring them and responding to ensure people have the right to exercise their right to freedom of expression and assembly. So please do let us know if you are having problems exercising those rights. If you have concerns about discrimination, I do really recommend contacting the Human Rights Commission. They have the ability to investigate discrimination, but I think the question also talked a bit about workplaces or unions not speaking up. And I think, even if your union or workplace has been silent so far, it's really important to continue to pressure them. We are seeing organizations, including unions, come out in support and come out to take action after pressure. So I think don't think silence means they're not hearing what you're saying, because they may well be. And I just wanted to note there are a lot of support services also available to people if you are looking for some that are culturally appropriate, particularly if you are Muslim. So do seek those out too, because there is a lot on, I think, on everyone's minds, but particularly for Palestinians and the people directly affected. So do make sure you are seeking support.
Thanks, Nikita. Did you want to add something, Ammar?
Not a huge amount. I think the only thing I'll add is not maybe a legal thing, but just I've found this to be, it's a bit of a muscle you train. Like it's up to everyone individually to suss out how, what the atmosphere is with their own company and what the personal consequences are, and don't do anything foolish necessarily. But it's also a bit of a muscle that you train to speak out. If you don't do it when you're not in a position of power, I find it's probably unlikely you'll do it when you are. So it's just part of the challenge with these things.
Yeah, awesome. Great tips. Okay, I might share my screen now and show you a little bit what our toolkit page looks like, and just take you through some of these actions, and talk you a little bit about as well what we will sort of try to release over the next weeks or so. Just give it a bit of time. Here we go. Everyone can see that. Can you see my screen? Yeah, okay, I'm getting some thumbs up. So this is our toolkit, and it kind of gets constantly updated. So you can go here if you need sort of like to see what else is coming up. So the first part is kind of like a summary of like what we're calling for and what needs to be done, and what sort of like our calls are on the Australian government. And then from here, it sort of like gives you a list of actions. So the first one, which is what Nikita was talking about in her sort of like initial address, is our action calling on Penny Wong to call for a ceasefire. So if you click here, it will take you straight to the action. This is quite an easy action. It's a template email. So you basically have to put your name, surname, and email, and it will just send off. And if you have already taken this action, which is very likely if you're at this webinar, you can share this action and make sure that family and friends and people in your networks do that as well. This is definitely having an impact on the discourse that has changed around ceasefire from the foreign minister. So I think the more we do it, the better. The second part is around sort of like educating yourself, amplifying lived experience. So this is something that Ammar also talked about a little bit. So you will see here there are different things. There's a series of stories that you can share that direct you to Twitter. There is, you might not see this. Give me 1 second. Let me see if my screen shows you. Oh yeah, it does. This is a list of, you see the top name here is Apen, but it's a list of accounts that you can follow and share from if my laptop loads. Otherwise I'll show you in a second. And then there's like a list of groups that you can follow to educate yourself on what's happening on the ground. And we'll continue to update that. As you can see here, our webinar is listed. Two of the things that are coming up actually over the next 2 weeks, which you might find quite useful, are a resource that's around trying to like debunk some of the things that you read online and remove bias and give you tools to like combat misinformation and disinformation. And so some of the things that Ammar was saying around, you know, reaching out to your media outlet if you don't like the way they have covered this issue specifically will be kind of part of that. And then another one, which I guess relates to another question that someone had, is on how you can have conversations. So it's kind of like a little guide on some of the things that people might bring up when you have conversations and these that you can try and implement. The third one, which is very important, is to show up and stand in solidarity. So this is joining rallies and vigils that are happening like weekly across Australia in solidarity with the Palestinian community. And we have this neat little tool where you can just put in your address and find the nearest vigil, rally. There can be like small gatherings, sort of like workshop sessions, all those things. So feel free to go in here and find one. And if you don't find one, or if you yourself are organizing one and want to let us know, you can just send us an email and we'll add it to the map as well. And we have some details here on how to stay safe at protests, and if you want to do more things like becoming a legal observer. And then the second part of this toolkit is around sort of like lobbying, so what we were talking about before in the question as well. So this first part is around emailing your MP, and it gives you a bit of like tips on how to do it and sort of like things to include and not include when you send your email. But I want to actually show you what this looks like in our tool, which will make it much easier for you to do this. So this is like the page. So I'm just going to put in an address like 300 Albert Street. So if you can see here, you get the sort of like your MP for your area, and it gives you here a little bit of a description as to like where they're sitting on the ceasefire, which is the call we're making with this action. But if you scroll down, when you get to compose your email, it gives you tips here. So here it tells you add your name and electorate, which you must do because that part hasn't been changed, so you need to make sure you do that. But most importantly, you need to make sure you personalize this email. So we've given you a template with sort of like the general calls that we're making on MPs, but it's really important to add your own personal value as a constituent to this. So whether it's like at the beginning or sort of like after the second paragraph, you can just add a few lines and it really has an impact. And so make sure you add your first and last name and your email and just follow these tips. And so these tips will change based on the stance of your MP. So every week or so, based on the meetings that we have with MP or how MP have spoken out, we try and update this. So if you see, as alongside the MP, we also include senators. And you can see here that some of them have different opinions. So they will receive a different text of the email that you don't have to take care of. You just take care of the email for your own MP, and you can decide whether you want to send them an email as well or not. So you can click and unclick, but it will tell you here, this MP has spoken about, but has not called for a ceasefire. This MP has not supported calls for a ceasefire. So all of those things will be in there when you do it. And then you just have to, as I said, put your first and last name, your email, personalize the template, change the name, put your electorate, and then just hit send, and you will receive a copy of it in your email as well as it goes out. So that's quite an easy way of doing it, and it has quite a lot of impact. And if you get a response from your MP and you're like, oh, this is really useful, feel free to forward it to us so we can use it when we then go and do our own lobbying. I'm not following the chat, so let me know if there's anything that I need to answer, but it sounds like it's good. And then the second part of this is the call your MP part. So when you take the email your MP action, that page will actually redirect you to the call your MP page. So you can do them in the same go if you want, especially because you would have already started thinking about what to say in your email. It makes it much easier to make a phone call. But we've included some key points here and giving you some tips. But those things are also in the page itself. So when you go to the page, in this case, say we put the same address, 300, what did I say, Albert Street. It will give you the number of your MP, so you don't have to look it up. It will tell you which electorate it is. And then it gives you a few sort of like tips on how to do it. And then it gives you the talking points as well. So you can just call them up, say your name, say that you're a local constituent, give a bit of your personal opinion on this, and then make some of the points that we've added in here. And then we just ask you to put your name and surname and leave us some details. Most likely you get through an assistant, or you get through leaving a message, and that's totally okay. It's still good to leave a message. Just let us know and then submit, and we'll have the information for us to make sure that we know who we're targeting. The final thing on here is then just to engage those the MPs on social platforms. So, you know, if you follow your MP on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, comment on them if they make a statement on this, and call on them to call on a ceasefire. So as I said, this will continuously get updated as we develop more resources and we build more things. But for now, it's got quite a lot in there. And on top of that, you have all the things that Ammar shared with you. So you can take a million actions and join a lot of things on offline as well. So let me just check how we're going with time. Okay, we're 5 minutes to go. So I've kind of wrapped up the action side. So we might just take a bit of time if there are any final questions. And if there aren't any, we'll wrap up. But I think there are a few.
So I had a question about hard copy petitions. It's in the chat.
Yeah.
Is there a hard copy petition page?
We can create that. So we currently have a petition that's correct me if I'm wrong, Nikita, is around hospitals. Is that right? So we can, but you could also make a petition, the same email action that we have. So basically a petition that's directed at anyone calling for a ceasefire. We also have a global petition that's been pushed around that we can share with you if you want to do it. I think we've reached a pretty high number on that globally. So we can follow up with you and share that petition if needed afterwards, for sure. Let me see. Are there any other questions? People have any questions that they want to ask? They want to raise their hands, or if they want to pop them in there. In terms of recording,
I'm happy to chat to Phoebe.
Yeah, go Nikita.
Question just quickly, because that's I think a question that's come up a bit when we've been meeting with MPs and in the media particularly too, kind of saying you know, the what about Hamas line when it comes to a ceasefire. And I think that's why we've been really clear that we are calling for a ceasefire from all parties. And there has been, you know, unfortunately, what we've seen in the last 16 years is, I got up early this morning, so my brain is failing me, but 6 outbreaks of conflict. This is the 6th or 7th. And each of those has ended in ceasefire. So that has happened before. It's not an impossible ask. But I think it's really important to be noting when we're talking about this, and ceasefire is the steps afterwards. Because as I said, we have, you know, continuous rounds of conflict that lead to the deaths of too many people, and most of those people are Palestinians in Gaza. And so we need not only a ceasefire, but we need to see steps taken to improve the lives of those people in Gaza, like addressing the blockade, ending the blockade, addressing apartheid. Because we've seen for decades now this military response, right? And I think I went to the press club today, and the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine made a really good point. And she said, you know, we've been addressing this militarily for decades, and it has not made people more safe. It hasn't led to the rights of Palestinians, but it also hasn't led to the protection of rights of Israelis and for security for Israelis. And so we need to not only see this as, you know, in this, I think in Australia particularly, we talk a lot about Israel and Gaza and the West Bank when there are outbreaks of conflict, and then we go back to not talking about them. And that's when we see Amnesty, you know, raids on people in the West Bank, airstrikes on people in the West Bank. And so we really need to be making a concerted effort to end rights abuses, not only in these conflict scenarios, but that are ongoing, because I think the other thing we've been saying around, you know, this kind of statements we're hearing from Israeli ministers that the intention is campaign is to eradicate Hamas, is that you cannot eradicate a group or all armed, action through military intervention. I think we've seen that in recent years with the return of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And so we also need to be challenging this narrative that, it is possible in what Israel is doing at the moment to somehow eradicate Hamas, and that's somehow leading to peace and prosperity. That will not happen. We need to be addressing the root causes. So that's what we've been saying to MPs, but also to people who've been asking us those questions. But it's obviously about what's happening today, but it's just as important, I think, to be talking about what happens tomorrow, because we can't return to the status quo.
Awesome. Thanks, Nikita. We are at time. We have a couple more questions. We might try and get back to you in case we didn't get it. I also feel like I missed some things, but I just wanted to give a last few words to Ammar, whether you want to say a final few words before we wrap up, and Nikita as well, if you want to add anything at the end.
Not a huge amount from me, to be honest. On my end, actually, there is a question which probably is a good way for me to end, which was about someone, I think it was Harriet, who asked when he went to his MP's office, they said, well, there's no point calling for a ceasefire because Netanyahu has rejected it. I mean, in terms of countering that kind of logic, it's, if we're not putting pressure, then by definition, we're just being complicit anyway. And so whatever we feel, however effective or ineffective we feel what we're doing is, we're certainly going to be completely ineffective if we do nothing. Like, that's guaranteed. If we do something, if we speak up, if our government actually develops a bit of a spine and takes a stance on this, it can only add more pressure. But if we do nothing, then for sure, we're accomplishing nothing. So I think, don't ever be paralyzed out of taking action because we don't know if it'll be effective or not. It's definitely more effective than doing nothing.
Thanks, Ammar. Nikita, did you want to add any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I think that's perfect.
That's perfect. Yeah, I thought so too. Thank you, Ammar, and thank you, Nikita, for your time. And thanks everyone for joining us tonight. I will probably try and send you all an email by tomorrow morning with the recording and sort of like any other resources. I'll share both the ones that Ammar sent in the chat and the ones that we shared. And yeah, if you can all, I think someone in the chat said it would be great if we all call our MPs tomorrow. That would be a great action to take away from this, to take 5 minutes tomorrow in your day and find your MP and call on them to call for a ceasefire. That would be an awesome action to come out of this. So look out for my email tomorrow and for more things you can do to take action. And thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, everyone.